Hello and welcome. My name is Noah Sager. I'm a product engineer on the ArcGIS API for JavaScript team. And I'm here today with Renee Rubalcava, a software developer also on the JavaScript team. And we're here to talk about using TypeScript with ArcGIS API for JavaScript. So there's me. Quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. The first thing we'll cover is what is TypeScript. Some people may have heard about TypeScript but haven't started using it yet. Maybe you've heard about some of the benefits or popularity of TypeScript, but aren't sure if it's worth the effort to learn a new language. In this session, we will learn some of the basics of TypeScript and how it can help you as a developer using the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. Now, internally, we use TypeScript quite a lot on the JavaScript team. In fact, about 99% of our API is written in TypeScript. So not only can you learn how to use TypeScript to unlock the full potential of the API, but there are also some things you can only do with TypeScript, and we'll mention more about that later. We will also look at how to set up a development environment and how to use the provided TypeScript definition files. Now, this presentation is about using TypeScript with the JavaScript API, so we're assuming that you already have some degree of familiarity with the JavaScript API. If not, the best place to get started is with the online SDK, where there are numerous guide topics and tutorials that explain the fundamentals of working with the API. The current version is 4.14, and we anticipate releasing version 4.15 by the time you view this recording. After we cover that, Renee is going to take you through a live action demo to actually show off some of the bells and whistles of TypeScript, and then we'll also share some places where you can get more information. So let's dive in. What is TypeScript? So TypeScript is an open source programming language that is a superset of JavaScript. TypeScript builds on the successes of JavaScript while improving on its weaknesses. What we mean by superset is that JavaScript code is valid TypeScript code. You could basically rename your JavaScript files to TypeScript files and start using TypeScript today. TypeScript transpiles into JavaScript, which is really just a fancy way of saying that it compiles into JavaScript. The reason we call it transpiling is because TypeScript and JavaScript are at similar levels of abstraction or similarly distant from machine code. Now, the best place to begin is with the actual TypeScript website. Let's take a look at that. Here you can find lots of documentation tutorials and really get your hands dirty with the language before you begin programming with it. Now, setting the JavaScript API aside for a moment, TypeScript is typically easier for multiple people to work on, easier to refactor, and easier to test. And all of these things help prevent technical debt. The reason we say these things about TypeScript is that if you're typing out interfaces, then you have well-defined contracts between different parts of your application. Then it's easier for another developer to jump in and understand what's going on. And also you'll notice that TypeScript's motto, JavaScript that scales, that isn't to say that JavaScript does not scale, but that TypeScript scales even better when you're thinking about the long-term health of your application and the different people that will eventually work on it. And it's also compatible with every different flavor of JavaScript. All right, the next thing you want to do is come over to our online SDK and check out the developer setup for TypeScript with the JavaScript API. We're going to cover almost all the information on this page, but it's nice to know you have a place to come back to where you can review the steps to actually get started with TypeScript and where to run into or where to find additional resources. So this online page is a great place to keep bookmarked. All right, so I've explained to you at a high level what TypeScript is. Now let's get to the selling points, why you should consider using TypeScript. The first is right in the name. TypeScript adds type support to JavaScript. So let's take a look at the code snippet we have here. We have a variable named URL that we assign a long string to, and then we have a function called createFeatureLayer. Now this function takes two parameters. One is URL and one is legend. Inside this function, we have a feature layer constructor that takes the URL and the legend parameters and uses it to create a new feature layer and then add it to the map. And below that, we actually call the function and we pass in two parameters. Now the nice thing about this is if you look in the feature layer, the createFeatureLayer function, you'll see colons after URL and after legend. These are the types. We're saying that we want URL to be type string and we want legend to be type Boolean. This way, when someone comes to use the function later, they can easily see what types of parameters this function expects. Now, what goes along really nicely with this is the error handling that our IDE has. Now, there are a lot of different IDEs that support TypeScript. Internally on our team, we use Visual Studio Code a lot. What's nice about Visual Studio Code is because it was made by Microsoft and because TypeScript was developed by Microsoft, it has a lot of really good IntelliSense and error checking functionality that can help you with your development efforts. So let's take a look at an example of that. Here we have an example of an error that the IDE is giving us. Now this occurs before we run the application and before we do anything else other than writing code. Now the code in the snippet here is very similar to the one that I just showed you, with the exception of the URL variable is now an integer instead of a string. So when I try to pass in that to the function, I immediately get an error that says argument of type 12345 is not assignable to parameter of type string. This helps me know that I've assigned an integer type to a variable that should take a string type. So already I'm saving time while writing my code and fixing errors as I'm actually writing, as opposed to afterwards when I'm running the application and trying to debug. So that's a big win there. Another really cool reason to use TypeScript is it can make use of the latest JavaScript features. If you've heard all the hype about ECMAScript 6 or 7 or ES5, all of these are different flavors of JavaScript and they have different functionalities. Now you can use all of these in TypeScript today, and in fact TypeScript has been a big promoter of adding new functionality to JavaScript. One of the really nice ones we use a lot on the team is called async-await. So on the left here we have a demo theater function which calls a getQuestion function. The getQuestion function returns a promise which, once resolved, calls another function called question. So this is the typical promise syntax with lots of .then and nested statements. Now on the right, we have those same functions, but this time we've made use of async-await functions. Since we make the demo theater function an asynchronous function, we can use the await method in the getQuestion function to wait until the promise is resolved. The functionality is exactly the same as on the left, but with far fewer lines of code. And this is one of my favorite, dynamic module loading, also known as lazy loading. So when you import or require modules in your application, that requires the browser to download that information. Now, sometimes those modules aren't going to be used by the end user, and so you don't need to pay that cost up front. What you can do instead is dynamically load that module and only download it when it's actually going to be used. So for example, say you had some printing or routing in your application, and if the end user doesn't use that functionality, there's no need to import those modules. So you could add them inside an asynchronous function and instead load the module there. This will also help you have your application run faster and more efficiently. Now we'll get to the bleeding edge. So this is brand new to TypeScript, and this is something that TypeScript has been championing to get added to JavaScript. It's called optional chaining. Now, at its core, optional chaining lets us write code where TypeScript can immediately stop writing some expressions if we run into a null or undefined. So the star here is the question mark period operator for optional property access. So here we have two lines of code. Let's actually start at the bottom, where we have let x equal, and then if foo equals null, or if foo equals undefined, then return undefined. Else return the baz method of the foobar property. So what we want to know is we want to make sure that our variable is hydrated, and then we want to use a property inside of it. So instead of those three lines, we could actually just write that top line where we just use the question mark period operator, and then we have a very elegant and very clean way of writing the same expression as below, but with fewer lines of code. Now, what goes along with optional chaining is this really cool term called nullish coalescing. And this is something that is heavily used by our app development team because it's also very nice and elegant. Here we have two question marks, and let's compare the two lines of code. So on the bottom, we have let x equal if foo is not null and if foo is not defined, then return foo, else return the bar method. So we can write that same line, except in one line up at the top where we say let x equal foo, question mark, and then the bar function. So we're not introducing new functionality per se, but the code is far cleaner and more elegant and kind of more pleasing to look at. So this is another great reason to consider using TypeScript. Okay, so we've talked about some of the nitty-gritty. You've gotten the high-level overview of what TypeScript is, why you should consider using it. But here's kind of a nice story. So this is where it's more about the journey than about the destination. So here in the code snippet, we have three types. We have one type, data, that has two properties, coordinates, which is type array of number, and place name, which is type string. We also have a type called asset that has two properties, location, which is an Esri point, so we know we're using the Esri library, and also a name property, which is of type string. Then the third type is data to asset. So type data to asset takes a data and returns an asset. Now how that happens is not defined by the type, it's just a guide. So using something like TypeScript, you can really force yourself to think about what the point is of the application and how you want it to work. This makes it easier to extend in the future and thus reduces your technical debt. Now let's start over at the beginning. The recommended way to install TypeScript is via Node and NPM. So a lot of developers are already familiar using these tools. And if you're not, this is a great opportunity to get to use them. So the first thing you want to do is install TypeScript globally, and we have the command here. And then to work with our API, you're going to want to have our API typings. Now the snippet here is for the 4.x version of the API. We also have typings available for the 3.x version. It's referenced in the documentation, but I believe you just add an @3 to the end of this line of code. Another thing worth mentioning is that even though we're talking about using TypeScript, you can still use the JavaScript typings without TypeScript. You can actually install these typings and still get the IntelliSense and the error handling that we saw before in the earlier screenshots. You can get that just with plain JavaScript. So there's more than one reason to want to install these JavaScript typings. All right, with that beginning of the journey out of the way, I'm going to pass it over to Renee, and he's going to show you some live action demos and tips and tricks. Renee?
Little cough, sorry. Clear my throat. Thanks, Noah. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some tips you can use with TypeScript and the JavaScript API. The first one's going to be that we actually have a snippet extension for VS Code. You can find that by searching for ArcGIS API JavaScript in VS Code, or go to the Visual Studio Marketplace, and you can install it inside your VS Code IDE. So let's take a look at how that kind of works, right? So we kind of give you some ideas here in this little animated GIF of how some of this works. Most snippet extensions, you go through, you start typing a couple of letters, you press tab, and now you have some different options. So let's look at that something here. So first, I'll go ahead and I'll set up a HTML page. All right, so that's the first one. And if we come back to my talk over here, so we got our page. Now we have a snippet for get API, right? So this is one of the things that you're going to do like all the time, is you need to add the API into your application. You can just start typing get, and I got get API. If I tab, and there we go. It's added the link for the CSS. It's added all of the Dojo config needed to be able to load the API. So I've got my local application. You even get the option to pick the version of the API that you want to use from the CDN. And I'll just stick with the 4.14, which is the latest version. And it's going to go ahead and add the script tag for the API down here as well. Now I can go ahead and start adding the required tag and writing my code as I need to. Right? That's really, really cool, and a really good way for you to kind of get started with the API and get things going. Let's talk a little bit about the TSConfig. So the bare minimum you need for TSConfig is listed here. Don't worry too much about what everything means, but basically this lib option, when you add DOM, means you're going to be using some DOM APIs in your application, so it's not like a Node app. We're not going to use all the ES 2015 features. We're really just going to be using promises. If you want to use everything, you can just put ES 2015 here. Or as we got here, ES, we also want to support ES5 stuff as well. But you can also just put here, like, I think like ES, the latest would be ES 2019. I'm not sure, I believe TypeScript also has ES 2020 option if you want to support those functionality as well. Modules. So we're going to output our TypeScript files as AMD files. They can be consumed by the JavaScript API's AMD loader. So that's where you're going to put in here as a module output via AMD. Source map true. I typically leave this on because if you are using any build tooling like Webpack or something similar, they will also have an option where you could turn off the source maps for the output of your code. But if you're just using regular TSConfig, leave them on for now. And if you need to work through some kind of like custom development and production workflow, you can set up your NPM scripts to load a development and production TSConfig based on the script that you run. But we'll leave them off for now. We want to target ES5 because we want to be able to support maybe IE11, which is fine. So you can set that target and it'll go ahead and do any kind of shims you need. Basically, it's going to use any polyfills needed for modern JavaScript stuff from a library called tslib. And it'll do things like object destructuring, array destructuring, and so on. Things like that you might want to use will be included in the output of your code. No implicit any true. This is a good one to keep on, especially if you start getting started with TypeScript, because it's very tempting when you hit TypeScript errors to just type something as any and then just let it go. You really would like to try and define your types up front if you can. If you're not sure, then maybe any is a good choice, but you really should try and force yourself to start defining those types, because I do use as any sometimes when some of the types aren't behaving, but if you can, please try to type your types. And then if you want to suppress any of those errors on objects, you can do that as well. We do this because, just do this, because object indexes and any's can get kind of weird. Just set this to true. ES module interrupt, and we'll see why ES module interrupt set as true is important, because when you do that, you can use some of the modern syntax for importing the JavaScript files. So here, the next slide, we have another tip, is to hide the JavaScript and JS map files inside of your VS Code browser. So if you add this couple lines of code here into your preferences to be able to exclude files, you'll only see the TypeScript files whenever there is a JavaScript file that goes with it, right? So when you compile your TypeScript, most of the time it'll output the JavaScript next to the TypeScript files, depending on how you set up your TSConfig. But when it does that, it's kind of annoying to be able to see the JavaScript file right alongside the TypeScript file, right? So you don't want to see all of that. So this will kind of clean all of that up for you. Just removes a lot of that visual clutter. Debugging with source maps. And we're actually going to cover this in the demo in a second. But what's really neat is that you can actually set the breakpoints in the TypeScript file, right? So I have like a main TS here. I'll set a breakpoint there, and it'll actually do the breakpoint for the source of my TypeScript file. I could look at the output JavaScript. Maybe there's something I don't understand about what TypeScript is outputting my JavaScript to, and I need to look at that. But most of the time, and I say this with confidence, that 99.9% of the time, you'll probably not need to look at the output JavaScript unless you're just interested to see how TypeScript is building your JavaScript for you. You're never going to modify the output JavaScript. You try not to usually debug the output JavaScript. It's a very rare case you would need that. Okay, so here's the thing. When you're working with our typings are namespaced with an _ Esri. And that is to, in case someone else has declared an Esri object in their application, this is to kind of prevent any kind of name conflicts that are going on. But if you don't have that case, you can just go ahead and do import Esri equals _ Esri. It saves you like 2 keyboard clicks when you're writing your code to remove those underscores later on, because now you can see that when I get this item, I can go and type it as Esri.listItem here instead of _ Esri.listItem. Like I said, it cleans up some of that visual clutter when you're writing your code, and we all like our IDEs and our code to look really nice. It just removes a lot of that anxiety you might get when you're writing code, right? So where can you get more info? So we have a lot of documentation in the SDK regarding TypeScript and TypeScript as it relates to building apps. We have a lot of training and webinars, a lot of blogs. So if you come over here, we have this blog post we did a while ago. about using TypeScript with the JavaScript API. It's still very relevant today, even though it was a few releases back. A lot of this information is still something that you'd want to look at if you're getting started using TypeScript with the JavaScript API today. There's also resources on GeoNet, which a lot of the team does monitor. There's the GIS Stack Exchange or regular Stack Exchange that we keep an eye on as well. There's also a spatial community in Slack that we're all pretty active on, where you can ask questions and you can get help. Like I said, any TypeScript questions at all, you can feel free to ask any of us. We'll do the best we can to help you out. So at this time, I know it says build a TypeScript app from scratch. We're not going to quite build it from scratch, but we're going to get pretty close. So I have an application here. And I'm going to go ahead and get out of full screen for a moment. And let me go to my page here. And I'm going to go ahead and show you what this index.html looks like. You can see I used the snippets to help me get this started. I added this in here. I added this depths for the app main. This way I don't have to call it require. And I've got a TypeScript file here. And let's go ahead and comment that out because I'm not using a layer list just yet. So at this point, if we look at my package.json, I have a script that's going to run TypeScript, and I'm going to run it in watch mode. What basically we're saying there is that we're going to go ahead and run TypeScript. It's going to start watching for any changes for any JavaScript file, for any TypeScript files in our application. In this case here, I'm using NPX TypeScript. NPX is a library that comes with NPM when you install it and Node and everything. It basically lets you run libraries, something that globally without having to actually install it for later use. So it's kind of like a temporary install that you just kind of run once. So I'll do npm start here. It's going to go ahead and start a compilation in watch mode, no errors, and now we're watching for changes. So it went ahead and it's going to output my main.js file somewhere. So if I come back to my page, just refresh it just to show you that this is still working. Right, here we go. So I've got my layer and I've got my map. Now if we go to the source code here, I'll make this bigger. Let's go ahead and come this way. So when navigating source code, it's pretty straightforward. You'll have this different colored folder in here, and the source mapped files, which in this case is going to be the TS file, is going to be the one that's kind of italic inside of your Chrome DevTools. I'm pretty sure it's similar to the Firefox DevTools. I just haven't used the Firefox DevTools in a while. But yeah, you should have a similar situation there. So now let's say I want to debug, put a breakpoint here before I create my map views. Now if I refresh the page, you'll see that everything's been paused. I can go and check my map, and I can see, okay, I've got a map. There should be no layers at the moment because it's a length of 0, because it has actually, the map hasn't been loaded yet. There's no, I think the base map's gonna be null. Everything's pretty much not loaded at this point because I have not done anything to load the map, right? I'm stopped at the map view section. So if I go ahead and continue, we'll see that it goes ahead and now my application is gonna load. Now what I wanna do is I want to go ahead and I wanna add a layer list. So let's go ahead and I'm gonna set my import layer list from Esri widgets layer list. And I want to point out a really cool thing too in VS Code. So I've imported these modules from the JavaScript API, but now I can hover over them in VS Code, and you're going to get the actual JS doc that we have in the SDK in these little pop-ups. It's not the whole SDK documentation for it. There's snippets, but what they do is have a link to go back to the SDK and open the SDK documentation for whatever particular class you've been hovering over, which is really cool. I mean, that is nice, right? So now what I can do is I can go in here and create my layer list and add to the map. So let's go over here. Okay, so now I create my layer list. I'm creating a new layer list, passing it a view. For each, now here's where things get really interesting now. So I have a function on here called list item created function. This is going to go ahead and add list items to the layer list. This is where you can do some custom stuff in here. Now, if I hover over event, oh no, sorry. If I get the item here, since I went ahead and cast it as my event item, or as an Esri list item here, Now I get all the IntelliSense I need to work with it. So it's not going to be typed as an any. I can go item, and I think it was layer dot type, right? So you see all of that IntelliSense I'm getting here on the page. These are all of the properties and methods available on a layer, which is really, really cool. So if we come back to the page here, our demo application, let's take out that breakpoint for a moment. Refresh, and there's our source code again. And I've got my legend over here. And once again, my layer list with the legend inside. I can go ahead and I can stop in the loop. Maybe I want to see if something odd is happening inside of my loop. Because remember, I only care about layers that are type group. I don't care about any other types, or if it's not a group, right? So this particular first one is going to be of type feature. So that means that this is going to go ahead and run. And I believe it's the only layer in the map. So, oh, no, there's another one here. This one's another type feature, so we're good. That's going to run. And we've got another type feature. And what else we got? Another type feature. And we've got another type feature. So you can see how you can go through and you can start debugging your code to make sure that everything's working as expected. It's nothing wrong with console logs. I still use console logs and info all the time to kind of just look at my console to see what's happening. But if you really want to get to the nitty-gritty of runtime and find out what is happening inside your code, you definitely want to start taking advantage of using breakpoints to do that, which is a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and let's look at another project, because we've got time and this is all fun stuff. Okay, so here's one that's much more extensive. This is a nearby application. It's an example app. And if you come into the README here, it's got information about the example app. This application is built with TypeScript, Webpack, our Webpack plugin, a number of other tools. It's a fully built progressive web app, meaning that it's built for performance, or as much performance as we could squeeze out of everything that we've got. All right, so if we look at the source for this, you'll see that without getting into the React parts of everything, I want to look at some of the stuff that's specific to the API. All right, so in the API, I've got these, all these modules and stuff that I'm loading, but I've got all of these different interfaces that I'm loading in. So I have an interface for listen for locate props, which is something for the location information I'm pulling. I have a nearby item interface. I have this properties are going to go to a function called update extent change, right? So these are the interfaces that I'm pulling into my application. They're going to kind of guide my development. Now, if we look at those interfaces, in here, you can see how I've defined them in here. So I have a, what's going to be used in my application is called a nearby item. It looks an awful lot like a graphic feature, right? It has an object ID. I've got some attributes in here, but you notice location's part of those attributes, right? So this is how I expect to get my data. I'm also going to apply a bearing and a distance to it, and I'll have an icon for the string. And if we come down here some more, I have something for like that, the app position. This is a position for the actual device that you're on. There's other things in here, but then like I've got the app state, right? So this is the interface for my entire application, everything I expect my application to handle. It's a little bit more than I would have liked, but it works out pretty well. So I have a bunch of categories. I have, and again, this kind of shows where I have an interface app state, but I have a property on there that's a type of a nearby item, which is another interface I've defined in my application. I didn't need to, in this case, have that there. I could have just copied what I had for nearby items interface in here. But this is what is typically referred to sometimes as aliasing types, right? So I can alias this to other things. For example, the hasload geolocation permission, I could have aliased this Boolean type as something called has geolocation. And it referenced it very explicitly there. Sometimes I do that and sometimes I don't. It kind of just depends what you're working on. I have something for lat long in here. And then these are all kind of specific to some React stuff that's happening inside of my application. But once again, this is kind of how you can take advantage of these interfaces to do some really cool stuff. Now let's look at, I've got, oh, this is really cool here. This places one. So you see that in the, and I have this function called find nearby places, and it takes the first property latlon that I expect to be the interface of latlon that I got earlier, but I'm gonna go and convert that into like a point. So I know latlon's already got the latitude, longitude, and I can just pass it off to the point, which works out great. All right, it's a great way to be able to use those interfaces and get the IntelliSense I want from the API, right? So that's some really, IntelliSense from VS Code to do that kind of stuff, which is really cool. All right, so let's get back over here. And I do also want to point out some of the documentation some more. So if we go into the guide here and you go under, I believe it's developer tooling and TypeScript setup. Noah showed some of this stuff earlier, but we do have a link to like the bare bones TSConfig you might want to use. It actually has the include for the app and then excludes node modules. JSX Factory TSX, so this is if you're going to go ahead and do something like build widgets with our JavaScript API framework that we have for doing widget development. If you're not, you're probably not going to need this, but it's still kind of cool to have if you're not doing other development. We've also got recommendations on folder structure, the instructions on how to install the typings. Ooh, bonus. I forgot about the bonus stuff. Oh yeah, we have a demo application that is available on our JS API resources repo. So this is a really cool repo that you can go to find other resources related to the JavaScript API, and we have this repo that's related to TypeScript. So this is similar to the application I just showed you, something that you can download pretty quickly and then run right away. But it also comes with things like TSLint, which is basically a way that you can, if you haven't done linting before, it's just some rules you set in place into how your code is written, right? So maybe you only want to use tabs instead of spaces, you only want single quotes instead of double quotes, things like that. You can also set it so that you do not, you don't allow a developer to specify types in the application. They have to specify interfaces instead, things like that, which is really kind of cool. So like I said, it's a fairly straightforward application, but it gives you a really good idea of how to develop with TypeScript and the JavaScript API. So you see the demo application really helps you out to learn how to write an application using TypeScript and the JavaScript API. It's really useful that way. We've also got guides on widget development. You heard me mention that with the TSConfig information. So if you want to do widget development with the API, you can, and actually you do have to use TypeScript in this case, because we have particular decorators that you are going to want to use for widget development, right? So we have instructions on how all that works here. We have instructions on all the lifecycle methods in here. So there is a post initialize, which is going to happen, I believe it's just before the render function happens. So if you have to do some kind of fetching of data or something like that, you can do it in there. And the important part here is the decorators. So we have these TypeScript decorators that are available for widget development where you do the subclassing. And this is basically so that we can properly do multiple class inheritance with the decorators here, but it's something that we don't really recommend you do. It's not something that will be multiple inheritance. It's not something that's going to change in the future, but for now, that's kind of how you do it. We have a declared helper to help you do that. Properties, we have a property decorator that deals with turning your properties of your class into accessors. If you're not familiar with accessors, please read the documentation on them because it's very cool. Just by adding this property decorator to your application, you automatically make that property something that's watchable. So you can just watch for that property to change and then do something with it, which is super powerful. Renderable is a great decorator because what you do here is you apply the property decorator and the renderable decorator. And at that point, if that property changes, it's going to go ahead and schedule a render for your widget. So the widget's UI state is you're making a contract that's going to be dependent on whatever that property is for some reason. right? Alias of is really cool because you might have, in this case here, like we have a view model for a widget, which is kind of how our widgets work. We have the view models for the business logic, and the view is just for the UI. You could have alias the properties for the view model to the widget. That way, your users of your widget don't have to do something like, mywidget.viewModel.name equals. They just do mywidget.name equals. That's what the alias of handles for them. And we've got doc here on extending the widget. So we have a base widget class that you can use to build your own widgets, which is what you're going to want to use for widget development. And again, we've got some more doc here on how the properties and the renderables and everything kind of works together. And then we have the doc on the rendering of the widget. So we do use JSX in the API. One thing to keep in mind is that you can also pass elements. Well, you can't necessarily pass the elements. Well, what you're going to do is, like, you can't just say view is equal to view. You have to grab the class first, and you're going to have a way to grab this element after the widget's been rendered. Then you can start applying something to it, right? So we don't support this JSX syntax for our widgets, but you just go ahead and create them, and everything's good to go. That's why you do like new widget everywhere. Remember I mentioned the post initialize. So this is really neat because now you can go ahead and add any watch handlers you want to the actual widget. So if you want to watch for properties to change on the widget, then do something with it, you can do that. There is a helper method for anything that you do like that. If you do any kind of watch handling inside your widget, you just pass it to this.own, and that this.own method is going to take care of cleaning up those handlers after the widget has been destroyed. And there's a .destroy on the widget that will take care of all that for you. And again, our documentation, all this is really cool because not only do we've got the classes in here, where you can go ahead and look at the click on a tab for this, the way how to style the widgets. The after create method, so this is where things come really handy. So if you want a widget in a widget, then this is what you would use. You would have an after create method, and then you would do something with that node that's going to call a function that's going to get the element, and then maybe create a new widget with that element to attach it to, right? So that's kind of where the after create method comes into play. It's a lot of fun to use, and it's really useful. So we got more there. This talks more about the view model pattern that we discussed before with be able to go ahead and put the business logic in your view models. And a lot of this now gets into the full-on widget development that you would do on your own. But I think the important part here is the fact that you still need to use TypeScript for everything. TSX is going to be extensions for TypeScript files. You use JSX. If you're not familiar with JSX, like this stuff that we've been looking for here, you can look that up as well. It's basically HTML in your JavaScript with a little bit of sugar attached on top. All right, with that, I'd like to say thank you for coming to this session or to viewing this session. Thank you.